What is up, guys? Lord Nick here, bringing you another One Piece related video. This video, guys, is going to be going over the new bans, how this is going to be impacting the Tier 0 and overall competitive meta, and ultimately what are my opinions on the bans and how does this reflect for Rebecca, right? Because, we predominantly do Rebecca content here, so we should kind of refer to how does this impact that. So let's kind of get into it. Let's take a look. So for the Tier 0, is it in shambles? Kind of. Yeah, Tier 0 I think is going to be kind of reverting into a state of what the hell do we do now? We're going to be having to retest matchups. We're going to have, because new decks will be entering into the format. It is going to be much, much more open. So we're going to be looking at a lot of different new iterations of decks, along with just brand new decks coming into the format that haven't really seen a whole lot of play. And this could mean that there's a large shakeup as to who is the meta definers, because Law was one of the top meta definers. You know, as much as people, there was an argument, is Law good in OP07, which was kind of weird. But the argument was pretty easily made in the sheer number and quantity of decks that we saw, and everybody that was prepping for 08 knew that he was going to be a meta powerhouse in 08. So with Law gone, that shakes up the meta pretty steadily, and then with Any's lobby going away, we're going to see a lot less consistency in top end removal for Lucci specifically, which puts it more on par with something like Gecko Moria, puts it more on par with overall black decks in general. I think that. Sorry, a little bit tired. But I think that this was a overall good shift for the meta. I think that these two bans were probably two of the best bans they could make. My previous video that kind of discussed the bans themselves kind of went over why I think that the certain cards that could get banned were the ones that should have been banned. And of the three that I thought were the front runners for everybody's opinions, which was Gecko Moria, Law, and Black Maria, I very much felt like Law was the strongest of the three that could get banned, just due to the fact that Black Maria really didn't break any other purple deck and actually assisted in making purple more of a relevant individual color, whereas currently it is much more of a support color. So in the case of Law being banned, I think it is a very solid choice. It opens up the meta. It takes out a massive powerhouse who was going to be a balanced nightmare, as it broke both of the rules of red and purple by giving red consistent, efficient removal that allowed for you to also cheat out bodies, while also giving purple a useful Dawn minus effect that they could then use cards like Black Maria to return their Dawn and get them more efficiency out of their plays. So overall, it was too efficient, too statistically meaningful, and enabled you to do too many things of controlling the board while developing a giant board state, which was just something that needed to go. Whereas something with Any's lobby, a lot of people might be like, "Well, Gecko Moria is the better band. This target that would target all black decks. It would make black decks generically worse." The problem is it wouldn't just make black decks generically worse. It would potentially just kill black decks entirely. You could argue that there's a lot of removal. There's a lot of other top end options. There's a lot of other plays that you can do. But when the argument that you can't run Kuzan in any deck other than potentially Rebecca, just due to the fact that it's so clunky in late game and you need tempo and you need all these things, there isn't really much room to take away the only real top end of the color, right? Like, if that's the case, then Isho is also too clunky because he doesn't do anything to board state, he just punishes hand size. So then black becomes a color where people could just run it over, and it doesn't actually have any answers for removing stuff, which then means that the control premise of the deck is completely negated, just due to the fact that its efficiency into mid game and early game is just so terrible that any deck with a reasonable amount of early game tempo is just going to win the game versus it. So having something like Gecko Moria resets that tempo and gives black a fighting chance to win the game. And in many cases, I believe Gecko Moria is a bit overtuned in the fact that he gives you such a giant board swing because of the fact that he synergizes so many good on-play effects, such as like a Lucci Helmeppo play. But, you know, while it, yes, is annoying that black has this option, everybody else has a good top end option to a degree in every single color, except maybe that of purple, right? If we're looking at just 8-drops, ubiquitous, if we just look at 8-drops as the predominant category that we're looking for in comparing Gecko Moria, yes, he is the strongest of the 8-drops, but not like every other color's 8-drops are bad. If you look at green, their 8-drop is 8-drop Kid, and that card is seeing play in pretty much every green deck, but nobody complains about the fact that there is a package of Kid in every single green deck. They find it annoying, but nobody's bitching and moaning that it needs to be banned in the same vein that Gecko Moria needs to ban. If we look at yellow, their 8-drop is Katakuri, and he is seen in almost every yellow deck, and yet nobody is bitching and moaning that Katakuri needs to be banned, except me. I used to bitch that it needs to be banned. I think it's still just a busted in, too utilitarian variant. It has too much utility in one card. But then when we look over into blue, well, blue's 8-drops actually are pretty much non-existent. I can't think of a blue one. I've actually remade this video like 4 times over 3 days, and I still can't really think of a blue deck, blue 8-drop that comes to mind. But if we look at a blue's top end, nobody's really complaining that any of the blue top end cards are going to be needed to be removed. And if we look at something like a 10-drop Kaido that bounces an 8 and a 3, that has a very much similar board swing to that of a Gecko Moria, you know, not necessarily the same, but it also goes taller way easier than something like Gecko Moria does. So if that's the case, why is nobody complaining about this top end? Why is that top end not broken? Well, the biggest thing is that Gecko Moria is seen in the most prevalent color right now, right? Black is the strongest color considered by a considerable margin in most people's opinions, just due to the fact that it has the best overall removal package, and with Gecko Moria has the best way of getting back those resources that it's giving up to use said removal package. So when you are enabled to recur your stuff, it becomes more problematic for a lot of people because they have to play around that. That being said, I think the biggest thing is if you want black to be a solid color that is about recursion like that, then you have to start finding ways of making it so that if they want to utilize some of these amazing tools, they have to give up on the ability to either 1, fill their trash so easily, or 2, be able to recur them so easily. So I do agree that the recursion value being on such a big body is problematic, but when you look at a card like Rebecca, as much as people want to complain that 4-drop Rebecca is such a busted card, the stat efficiency of Rebecca, even though it cheats out another 3-cost card and gets you back a card to your hand potentially, is not necessarily all that stat efficient, right? You're dropping a 4-drop 0k. You are just not netting any power off of that card alone. So if you don't have a play for the Rebecca, it's kind of a dead card and has to sit in your hand. But it feels really bad to have to use it as a counter despite it having a 1k counter, right? You'd much prefer having it as a defending card. So if you don't have the consistency of being able to fill your trash, or you don't have the consistency of being able to play a good card, then she's not all that amazing. So right now, the fact that there's a kind of limited pool of 3-drops that are super efficient for her to play is pretty good. On top of that, it does require quite a few cards for it to actually pop off in a way for the certain 3-drop cards that people really want them to work with, right? So like you're being forced into Lucci in case of Lucci doing the Rebecca into a Spandine play. You have to have a ton of CP cards, which most of the CP cards, when you actually look at the CP package, are kind of ass outside of Rob Lucci and Spandine. And Tempest Kick. I would say Tempest Kick is the other pretty awesome CP card. But when you look at most of the CP cards, most of them are kind of terrible, right? Like, how many CP reducers do we use? Pretty much none of them. We use Eni's Lobby, which is a world government card. Remember, people are complaining you can't search for this card. But if you could search for this card, it would be even more powerful and bonkers than it is now, and it would already have been banned. So, like, when we look at this, the like template of CP0 cards, name a card outside of the current Tempest Kick, outside of 4-drop Lucci, and outside of Spandine, just because he can combo with Rebecca, who's insane, who's a ridiculous card in that package. None of them. They're boss monsters, terrible. Both of them are objectively bad boss monsters, right? When you look at the Rush Lucci, that is a terrible boss monster overall. It's not a terrible card overall, but it requires you to have this CP package for 1, and 2, it doesn't synergize with anything in the deck. It's just a rush down 7k, and that's not bad, but it's just no synergy to what the deck wants to do. When you look at Stussy, it does have synergy to what the deck wants to do, but it's a really slow late game card that can remove 1 threat, and with a current board state and game state that is about flooding the board, that's not necessarily all that huge, other than maybe if your opponent took their 9-drop turn to play a 8-drop Kid. But if they dropped it with a Rosinante, you don't even answer the Kid. They can just sack their Rosinante to keep it alive because it is KOing the Kid. So it's not a great boss monster overall. So when we look at that, the CP package, people could be like, oh, but 5-drop Kaku's really good. Is it though? Because you need 3 CP cards in your trash, which means you have to have another bundle of cards that is just kind of mediocre in your trash for him to be able to do his effect. And yes, he is statistically an okay card, right? A 1k counter for a 5-drop 6k that can remove a 3 cost is a card I would argue is the next best CP card, but he's not like insane. We don't see them running any Blue Nose anymore, which was a card that was like, oh wow, back in the day with old Lucci, this was probably the best tempo play you had. And nobody runs Air Door because, well, you're not trying to Air Door out anything right now. Despite the fact that now with Ennie's lobbies gone, you might see more tempo build Luccis that have use their removal to be more of a like spot removal to give them pressure. I honestly just think that most of the CP package is just worse when you compare it to something like the Navy package, for instance. And so because of this, if you want to use the Span 9 combo, you have to be using a worse package. Span 9's not OP, as much as people want to complain about Rebecca Span 9, right? So, like, you are making sacrifices to play these cards in these ways, right? So just look at it from that perspective. With yellow to play Katakuri, there's no sacrifice to play Katakuri. In black to play Gecko, you have to play synergistic cards for Gecko, and you have to play around the fact that you can't search him. He is an unsearchable leader, right? We don't have a Thriller Bark searcher. We do have one searcher that can find you 8-drop Moria, and that is a blue searcher, which means that is limited to 2 decks currently, both of which who have been considered kind of mediocre. One of them is just a terrible leader in general that can swing and is just there for the good color combination, and has showcased that is a potential list that you could run, is a kind of Warlords package to be able to utilize Black Moria in a blue Warlords build. But you also have Rebecca, who I've already kind of showcased multiple times. I'm just not a big fan of the Gecko build in Rebecca, and the biggest reason for that is that it just doesn't feel like it gives as big of a tempo shift when your leader can't attack. So ultimately, that's my soapbox about why Gecko Moria shouldn't be banned. And ultimately, I think that Ennie's Lobby being the black card ban is pretty solid, because I've just found that anybody that runs into it just hates this card more than even Ice Age, right? Like when my opponent uses an Ice Age on me, okay, my big guy's gone. But that Ice Age is gone after a turn. They don't have a way to follow it up the following turn to do it. Ennie's Lobby sits there and just is a constant -2 to whatever character they choose. And that is very toxic when you can synergize that with Lucci's leader ability and make it a -3. A -3 for free every single turn, no Donna investment, is obscenely powerful. So reducing it to a -1 is very potent. So when we look at, and just a little bit of knowledge there for you guys, these bans will take place as of September 8th here in the West. This means that we will be just entering into the OPO8 meta roughly for that to be then having this ban happen. So once we hit OPO8, that's when these bans happen. So I should probably be doing a review of what OPO8 leaders might be going into it, but I think we really need to retest them and refocus them, because a lot of them had build paths that involved them trying to match up into Law because of how meta-defining he was. And so we might find that the Calgara is insane. We might find that actually Black-Purple King is not as bad as people thought it was. Or we might find that, hey, Marco actually has a lot of potential in this upcoming meta. But for now, something in my eye, sorry guys. But for now, I'm going to leave them off of my upcoming candidates list. So who do we think is going to be replacing these two lists towards the top? Well, I think the easy answer here is that Gecko becomes probably the premier black deck. Him and Lucci are now going to be relatively comparable in their power. The biggest thing is that Gecko's ability, while it does cost on, does cheat out characters, whereas Lucci's ability is going to allow you to reduce something by 1 and fill up your trash pretty consistently. Gecko also fills up the trash pretty consistently, but ultimately I think that means that Gecko is just going to come out on top. I think he has a bit more versatility in the builds he could do. We might see more of a Navy package for Lucci that doesn't have Ennie's Lobby in it, and it might work out okay, but I think Gecko will just become the premier black deck currently. I think Enel, because now you don't have to worry about either Lucci as big of a threat of dealing with your top end cards, or the fact that Law can get out and under you before you can really set up, I think is no longer necessarily an issue. and thus he will go up in status. And then the ultimate deck that I think will become one of the most penultimate meta-defining decks is going to be Vinsmoke Reiju. The biggest reason I think that Reiju is going to be moving up so much is that the consensus I heard for why people weren't playing it was the fact that they thought it was an auto loss to Law. Law was always at lower Dawn than you, so your ability to play out your characters for cheap was pretty much negated. And most of their effects were negated. So it was considered an auto loss. I think that was kind of an overplay because Law did like to stay at a higher amount of Dawn, but yes, they could technically choke themselves to try to make Reiju useless. Ultimately, I think that was overstated, but I think Reiju is actually an insane powerhouse. I've played into this deck a lot, and I don't think it has any particularly insanely bad matchups. I think that the deck itself is at worst case roughly 50-50, maybe 40-60 in favor of its opponent in just a handful of matchups. I think this will become one of the most penultimate decks in the current format now that Law is out of the way and it is considered an insta-loss, is now completely gone and nuked out of the meta. So when we look into the new tier list, excluding OP808 leaders, we're going to be talking about meta-defining top 8 finders, and then the tier 2, which I think is still very competitive. These are going to be your top 16 decks, or have the potential for top 16. And this is, again, excluding OP08 in the conversation, despite the fact that it's taking place in OP08. And the biggest reason for that is that we do need to re-experiment with those decks. So when we're coming out of the OP07 meta, the people that we saw as meta definers, people that will be getting really good tools into this next set, and people that will be in decks that are just in general just really strong into what the format will be looking like. I think we have to, find that the meta definers are going to be, like I said, and now Reiju are going to be in the top. Gecko is going to be up there. Black Yellow Luffy's not getting hit at all, so this deck is going to be staying up there. And I think Nami has proven that it is a meta-defining deck. If you don't have a strategy to deal with Nami, you're just going to get ran over by the fact that it can just turtle up and then mill itself on your attacks. And it becomes very difficult for you to actually deal with. Despite the fact that you can kind of save up a board state and swing with multiple 11k or 12k or 13k swings, it's just a powerful, screw it, we're going to sit here and do this. And now they're adding hangers into so that you can't even do that game plan. You're being forced to attack into it, which it is now even more obnoxious and annoying. So when we look at outside of that top meta, right, these are the meta definers, the people I think will be infesting the top 8 all the time, the decks that will be going into the top 8. And this will be including the likes of decks that are getting buffed from their starter deck reprints. We will see Perona. I think that the Wano package is just way too good. Having a Pot of Greed on a one Dawn investment to just tap 2 kind of incidental characters, or something like a Ryuma gets rested on the turn it comes out, isn't actually that bad of a play, because if Ryuma dies by a swing of a character, that character most likely will be popped by the Ryuma, or it forces your opponent to have to put Dawn investment to try to get rid of him. So I think Perona is going to still see itself as a pretty solid deck in the format. I think Dofi, with the help from his starter deck, will become an insanely powerful deck. I think he's already kind of a very potent deck, and people are kind of sleeping on how good he can be currently. Yes, Boa is arguably the better deck just because she's better at controlling, and right now control is in a pretty good spot. But I think that the tempo and aggro that you can have with Dofi is going to be really, really nuts. So both of these decks, I think, will be able to see that kind of meta in there. On top of that, they're blue decks, which means that they'll have a pretty good matchup into Black Yellow Luffy by being able to bottom deck his Sabos and kind of negate his ability to turtle up while swinging big swings into you. And they're 5 life leaders, which is also an annoying nuisance for him in that regard. Lucci, I don't think, will fall completely out of relevance. I think it'll just not be a meta-defining deck. I think it'll just be a really good black deck. It and Gecko will kind of switch spots a bit now. When we move into tier 2, these are the decks that I said it will probably be able to top 16. And the reason I have Rebecca in this T2, into this T2, T1.5, whatever the hell you want to call it, the reason she is up here now, I think she's easily a very competitive deck again, and the biggest reason for that is our matchup into Enel is pretty much an auto win. Our matchup into Black Yellow Luffy is pretty favored into us, unless they see a lot of the Egghead Luffys, and then it can get a little bit rough for us. And then our matchup into Gecko is actually not bad. I've kind of learned that recently. I'd kind of been fearing it for a while that it might be pretty bad, but there's actually some plays that we can make that make it a relatively close matchup. Our matchup into Dofi is actually relatively okay for us because if he's just trying to flood the board, we can actually kind of manipulate and control his board pretty well. Likewise, Boa is a little bit grindy, but if we get to go second, we have a potential of beating Boa. Lucci without any sloppy is a much closer matchup than it was before. And out of all these decks, the two decks that we have the worst potential matchups into are going to be Reiju and Perona. I think Perona is pretty much an auto loss if it's the correct Wano package, just because she can just consistently rest our Rebecca blockers, or even if we want to put out Sabo blockers, it's pretty easy for her to deal with. And we just can't maintain tempo to keep him from smacking us in the face multiple times a turn, which is just problematic and difficult for us to deal with. Whereas with Reiju, if they get early Ichijis, it's just almost impossible for us to deal with. It's almost impossible for most decks to deal with if they get multiple Ichijis and follow-up turns on it. Nami is technically a bad matchup for Rebecca because we can't ever pressure with leader at any point. But if the Nami overplays an early turn and only has like one Dawn available to block with, if we have already developed a Kyros, we could just stick all our Dawn on our Kyros and swing into their face just to try to chip their life down some. So because of that, and then on top of that, I think that Rebecca has a really good matchup into the rest of the tier 2 meta. And then with that, because we have a great matchup into half of the meta defining matchups, and then a decent matchup into most of the top 8, Rebecca actually can sit in the tier 2 pretty comfortably. Whitebeard kind of follows the same suit. He has pretty good matchups into a lot of these decks, does pretty well into being an aggro deck, and I think he's just the most relevant red aggro deck that there is. With Lucci being kind of replaced out of the meta, it's kind of difficult for most decks to be able to deal with multiple 9-beard turns follow up in a row. And being an 8k leader, the only deck that really is contending with you is going to be Black Yellow Luffy in terms of being able to consistently put out pressure into your life as easily. Bonnie does get better, and there's an argument that Bonnie could become a top 8 contender. But the thing is I think that there's enough still bad matchups for Bonnie, and I think Reiju is a bad enough matchup coming in for Bonnie that it's going to be problematic for her, just because you can reduce any of her cards with Ichiji plays to be annoying. On top of that, you can use your you can be using your Nijis to just keep bouncing her forecast Urouge back to her hand, so she just has to keep either reestablishing their Urouge if she wants it, or if she wants to play other characters, you're just losing tempo. Ultimately, I think that's really bad for Bonnie and is very good for Reiju. Next up, Katakuri is going to be in our tier 2 just because with his starter deck, I think he does move up quite a bit. I just don't know where to measure how much up he goes because I haven't really seen a whole lot of gameplay as to how good he is going to be. It has been very annoying as a Rebecca player trying to play into it because the more consistent pressure of something like a Katakuri opposed to the starvation style of an NL is very difficult for Rebecca to deal with. Zoro, I think, is just a really solid red deck, and the same thing goes with Sabo. Sabo does have some triggers and some neat plays, and I think the addition of the Egghead Luffy actually is probably pretty good for Sabo, and people just haven't really kind of picked up on how good that could be for Sabo. And ultimately, I think that he is in a solid spot to be a really good aggressive deck. As for the rogue decks, we're not going to get too in-depth on them. They're just kind of fast, aggro-y, or have some unique styles to them that set them up pretty well. Dragon is just one of the... will probably become the best red deck. I think he has a lot of cool, unique tools, but there's just not been enough testing with it. And having seen it in the locals, I am more fearful of the fact that Dragon can pull off a lot of really cool aggro plays, whereas something like Whitebeard does take a little bit of time to set up sometimes. And Zoro, while he is very aggro, if he's playing the kind of like one-drop weenie list, it's kind of easy to deal with. If he's playing the chopper list, it is a little bit more annoying to deal with, but still somewhat okay to deal with because they're not all that fast usually. But with Dragon, they're almost all just rush cards that are then getting extra Dawn put onto them because you put 2 Dawn on your leader swing, drop a 3-drop Zoro, make him a 7k swing, so you get 2 7k swings on a 5 Dawn turn. That's pretty nasty. Ultimately, I think he'll be pretty good. Yamato is going to be doing pretty good with that Lana Wano package. I think it's still pretty solid. And with something like Lucci kind of taking a hit, it does still sting a little bit because it's still in the meta. Same thing with Gecko being in the meta. So there are still some kind of meh matchups for Yamato there. But I think that Yamato's ability of just being a pressure 2 out of life leader, and then also on top of that having a banish effect coming from Onami, can make this leader actually very prevalent in the coming meta. It's just that, it really depends on how many blockers people start playing. But currently, if you look at the top list, only 1, maybe 2 of those run a decent number of blockers to be kind of annoying. And then when you look at the ones after that, they each run maybe a 3-drop blocker, which you can kind of deal with being able to rest it out of the way. And then when we look into something like the 2 red-green decks here, Odin, I think, is just a kind of solid deck and can be rogue and actually has potential with some of his characters. And with the fact that Lucci is a little bit less consistent, there might be a chance there, but he's going to stay rogue. I probably should have put him at the bottom of rogue, with Ace is more of a, like, these are kind of fun decks that can sneak into rogue a bit. I think actually with the purple cards that are going to be coming in the next set, that Foxy moves up to being a pretty rogue deck. I think that Foxy actually has some pretty neat control pieces and some play styles that can happen, play lines that can happen, that make him pretty solid. And being consistently able to rest an opponent's leader when a lot of decks really kind of rely on the leader pressure, such as like Black Yellow Luffy, you could see that Foxy could actually become kind of a relevant threat to something in the meta. I don't think he's going to be like relevant enough to be a really good deck, but I think he could actually be kind of a rogue deck that can pop up from time to time in these tournaments. Kind of the same thing with Red Green Law. I think he has some rogue potential. I don't think he's particularly strong into most of these decks, but he has time and time again proven that he's resilient and people just have to crack the list. And I think he has enough cards and tools in his arsenal that he could potentially do that. And then for Blue Yellow Ace, I just personally like this deck, and I think its color combination is good, and it's getting a lot of tools with the Whitebeard package coming in blue next set. So I think that it's consistent, so you can go up and can be built around just 12 aces opposed to having to run any of the other brothers, and you get to just play around just being a deck that gets to heal itself basically every turn for like 4 Dawn investment, which is actually not that bad if you can just do that consistently. And then what about Becca in specific, right? Like I mentioned in passing there kind of why she's going into tier 2. Do I think this is going to be a good meta for Becca? I think if you are a Rebecca player, I think that this next set is going to have most of the tools that we kind of want to see and give us the best chance of becoming a competitively viable deck again. And the biggest reason for that is that Jack is going to be a very big nuisance for any other black deck to deal with. Yellow is going to have an option to deal with Jack, and blue is going to have an option to deal with Jack. And if black wants to deal with it, they're going to have to run Stussy, which, again, I've already kind of evaluated why Stussy is kind of a mid-play. It can be good, but like I don't see it being that great. But with Jack coming in, it gives us another 7-drop character that we can play around and a card that we can get back with Rebecca that can be very, very good at giving us consistent removal, hand filtering, and graveyard and trash filling. So with the inclusion of Jack coming in, we could see the rise of Becca. It's just going to have a bit of retooling. But the 2 decks that did get hit are 2 of my worst matchups as Rebecca, which does mean that obviously it should mean that we do better. If I was in a big tournament, I would be making content for it this year. I do apologize for not being able to get into those. I tried my best. It's just really difficult in the One Piece community to actually do it unless I'm on top of it. And I was working the last time the big tournaments dropped, so I was trying really, really hard to get into some of those October events, and they filled up instantaneously. It was just impossible for me to get in, unfortunately. So may not have the content for me being able to play competitively, but I would really, really love to see Rebecca do well competitively. But if you like the video, guys, please leave a like, hit the subscribe button if you haven't already done it. If you want, please leave a comment down below. I love hearing from you guys. I love to interact with you guys. I think it's kind of neat to see all the dissenting opinions within the comments, and kind of the talks that we get to have over if certain cards should be thought about or if certain game plans should be the way that we look at Rebecca. And until the next time, guys, I hope you all have a wonderful, wonderful day. Bye, guys.